When the Rock's teenage daughter Lena walks into school one morning, she has no idea that her worst nightmare is about to unfold. A racist teacher, Ms. Simmons, targets her for no reason and publicly shaves her head in front of the entire class just for fun. Humiliated and devastated, Lena rushes home in tears. But when the Rock finds out, hell breaks loose. Storming into the school with unshakable fury, he delivers a lesson in karma that no one will ever forget. As tensions explode, justice is served in the most shocking way possible. What happens next? Watch till the end, and comment if The Rock handled this the right way. The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch break, and students poured back into their classrooms, chatting and laughing. Inside Miss Simmons' history class, however, the mood was different. Seated in the middle of the room was Lena Johnson, an intelligent, kind-hearted, and confident 17-year-old girl with long, flowing black curls, a signature trait she inherited from her father, the one and only Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. Lena, despite her lineage, wore her celebrity status with quiet humility. Her attention focused on academics, athletics, and friendships. But amid the sea of friendly faces, one person, like a jagged rock in a calm sea, stood apart. Ms. Simmons, Lena's history teacher, harbored a deep-seated grudge against the young girl, a spiteful resentment born from jealousy and thwarted ambition. For Ms. Simmons, seeing Lena's potential, her charisma and intelligence, was like a constant reminder of her own unfulfilled dreams and failed attempts at success. Ms. Simmons' well-known reputation as a teacher was a twisted duality, a facade of professional decorum masking the poison of her prejudice and malice. Her subtle, cunning methods of demoralizing minority students, while fawning over her chosen favorites, were legendary in the school halls, the bite of her cruel remarks hidden behind a smile as sharp and piercing as a serpent's fang, and today her inner viper seemed poised to strike. The metallic staccato of Ms. Simmons' heels as she stalked into the classroom was the sound of a predator arriving for the kill. Her arrival, punctuated by the deafening thud of a textbook dropped onto her desk, was a warning to her students. She was in control, and she would tolerate no disobedience. With an icy glare, her eyes swept the room with the chill of a blizzard, before settling on Lena with a smile so cold the entire classroom seemed to shudder. "You," Ms. Simmons intoned, her voice dripping with venom. Confusion clouded Lena's expression as she glanced around, seeking clarity from her classmates, their confused expressions mirroring her own. "Me?" Lena's question was as uncertain as the uneasy atmosphere that permeated the classroom. Ms. Simmons' smile widened into a sadistic grin, her eyes glinting with anticipation as she repeated her command with an unyielding certainty. "Yes, you. Stand up." In response, the students, their silence a prison of fear and confusion, waited with bated breath, unsure of what would happen next. Lena, her confusion giving way to a rising sense of dread, complied with Ms. Simmons' instruction, her body tense as a coil. Ms. Simmons, taking advantage of Lena's uncertainty, prowled around her with a predator's confidence, her eyes studying Lena like a trophy. "I've noticed something," she said, her voice cold and cutting as she folded her arms, her posture one of condescension and spite. "You sit in my class every day, thinking you're special, thinking you're above the rules." Lena, her frown betraying her growing confusion and distress, attempted to defend herself. I don't think that at all," Lena protested, her words a plea for understanding. But Ms. Simmons was relentless. Leaning in, her voice like a cold blade against Lena's skin, she sneered. "Oh, but you do. You walk in here flipping that wild hair of yours like you're some kind of royalty," she hissed. "But here's a reality check for you, princess. You're not. You're just another student." Lena's pulse raced like a frightened gazelle, the pressure of her classmates' gaze making her feel exposed, vulnerable, like a lone fish in a shark-infested sea. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand," Lena pleaded, her voice cracking with desperation. But Ms. Simmons, her facade of civility stripped away like a serpent shedding its skin, would not be silenced. "You don't understand?" Ms. Simmons interjected, her eyes flashing with vitriol. "Well, let me make it clear for you." As she turned toward her desk, a dark smile spread across Ms. Simmons' face like a creeping shadow, her expression twisted with a cruelty that defied reason. The electric clippers in her hand, their buzzing hum an omen of terror, sent a ripple of gasps through the classroom. Lena, her eyes wide with dawning horror, felt her stomach twist into a knot, her blood freezing in her veins as a chilling realization crept up on her. Ms. Simmons, her eyes alight with a depraved glee, flicked the clippers on with a menacing buzz like the sound of an angry hornet's nest disturbed from slumber. "You see," she continued, her voice as caustic as acid as she tilted her head, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "This school has standards, and I think it's time we clean up that mess on your head." The room was now utterly still, a haunted silence filled with the terrified anticipation of what was to come. You can't be serious," Lena stammered, her words trembling, her shock and disbelief warring with a growing sense of defiance. But Ms. Simmons' sneer was like a blade that cut Lena's hope to ribbons. "Oh, but I am," she hissed, her voice carrying the weight of authority. "Now sit down, Lena, unless you're willing to take detention for the rest of the year." The classroom became an oven of tension, everyone watching with bated breath, waiting for Lena's response. Lena, paralyzed by disbelief, her body rigid, her breath ragged, stared at Ms. Simmons as if expecting the nightmare to end, for the curtains to be drawn back and reveal it as just a cruel prank. Suddenly, as if breaking through a wall of shock and terror, two of Ms. Simmons' favored students sprung into action, their hands shooting out to grip Lena's arms like iron claws. Lena, her resistance smothered by her captors, was shoved down into the chair, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream. In the chaos, the other students, no longer willing to sit idly by, found their courage, their collective shock transforming into an angry chorus of protest. "Stop!" The cry, a deafening roar of anger and defiance, tore through the classroom, shattering the lingering silence. "You can't do this!" Another student, their voice a scream of rage and defiance, joined the chorus of protest, their courage spreading through the classroom like wildfire. Ms. Simmons, her face a twisted mask of grim satisfaction, let loose the clippers with a vindictive zealotry. The buzz of the blades, a dreadful metallic humming that struck like a guillotine's blade, drowned out the horrified gasps and shouts of protest. Lena, her hands gripping the sides of the chair so tightly her knuckles turned white, felt the cool blades slice through her beautiful flowing curls, the sound of their destruction echoing through the classroom like the toll of a funeral bell. Lena, her body trembling with anger, humiliation, and fear, struggled to maintain a facade of defiance, her jaw clenched tight against the rush of tears that threatened to escape the corners of her eyes. The rest of the class, like silent witnesses to a public execution, looked on with a mixture of emotions, some crying in anguish, others frozen in shock, and a few filming the whole ordeal on their phones, capturing every moment of this cruel, inhumane punishment. Ms. Simmons, her sadistic smile triumphant, regarded her handiwork with a gleeful arrogance. "Yeah, there, now you actually look respectable." But the room, a tinderbox of seething anger, remained silent, the atmosphere thick with outrage. Lena sat motionless, her fists clenched tight, every muscle in her body tensed, as if coiled like a spring, ready to release its stored potential at a moment's notice. She didn't need to say a word. As she sat, her shorn scalp a scarlet badge of humiliation, a silent vow of vengeance stirred in Lena's soul. The seeds of retribution sown in that moment of violation and cruelty. This is only the beginning, she thought, a bitter fire burning in her heart. Because one thing was certain, the Rock, her father, would learn of this, and when he did, Ms. Simmons, that pitiful snake in the grass, would discover that she had unleashed a storm of retribution upon herself, a fury that could only be described as hell on earth. The school gates swung open, as if in deference to the behemoth that strode through them, his very presence rippling the air like a shockwave. Dwayne Johnson, his massive frame clad in a tight black t-shirt that clung to his torso like a second skin, moved with a singular purpose, his shoulders broad as an entire football team's combined, his muscles corded and ready for war, his expression a visage of pure, seething rage. The ground trembled beneath his feet, as if even the earth feared his wrath. The phone call, a single thread of distress in a hurricane of emotions, had been enough to ignite a nuclear inferno within the Rock. All it took were a few strained words, the sound of his daughter's tears echoing through the receiver, to turn his blood to liquid magma, a rage born from the primal depths of fatherhood. He had a single purpose now, a singular focus: to deliver divine retribution to the wretched soul who dared to lay a hand on his precious daughter. As the Rock stormed through the hallways of the school, an air of awe and fear radiated from his very presence, every student and faculty member frozen in his wake as if they'd been caught in the pull of a black hole. But the Rock's stony gaze didn't stray to the right or left, didn't seek directions or guidance. He didn't need to ask, didn't need to inquire. His bloodhound's sense of justice led him unerringly to the door of Ms. Simmons' classroom, the center of this storm of rage and vengeance. With the brutal efficiency of a battering ram, the Rock sent the door crashing open, the resounding bang reverberating like a clap of thunder through the halls, the force of its impact causing students to leap from their seats, their bodies instinctually responding to the proximity of danger. Ms. Simmons, caught unawares by the sudden eruption of sound and fury, spun around, her expression shifting from surprise to shock, and finally settling into a mask of feigned innocence. The Rock's gaze, intense and unyielding, locked onto Ms. Simmons like a guided missile, his eyes burning with a fury that could consume the world, reducing it to ash and cinder. The air in the classroom seemed to crackle with static electricity, the silence oppressive and heavy as an anvil, as if the very atmosphere itself was holding its breath in anticipation. Lena sat in the back of the class, her shaved head a testimony to Ms. Simmons' cruelty, her face hidden by the curtain of her shame, the weight of her humiliation heavy upon her shoulders. The Rock, his face a portrait of focused, primal rage, paused for a brief moment as his gaze swept across the room, seeking out the source of his unyielding anger. And when his eyes fell upon his beloved daughter, his heart clenched like a fist, a paternal instinct forged in the fire of 1,000 battles igniting like a supernova in his chest. Lena, her voice breaking through the oppressive silence, looked up at her father, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, the words slipping from her lips like a prayer for salvation. Dad. Ms. Simmons, her false bravado evaporating like mist in the sun, found her voice quivering with uncertainty as she spoke. "Excuse me, who are you?" But her words fell like pebbles upon granite as the Rock's fists clenched, his jaw tightening with a ruthless determination. His words, a growl emanating from deep within his chest, were loaded with a violence that promised swift and brutal retribution. "I'm the man who's about to teach you the biggest lesson of your life." Ms. Simmons, her throat dry as dust, her heart hammering against her ribcage like a trapped bird, stood frozen in fear as the Rock's massive figure filled the classroom door like a menacing specter, his presence saturating the air with an aura of danger and power. The silence that followed his words was a stillness punctuated only by the sound of Ms. Simmons' ragged breath and the ghostly echo of the nearby students' horrified heartbeats. The depth of Lena's anguish, her soul wrung dry by humiliation and violation, was etched in the darkness of her eyes. The shame of her shaved head, a cruel badge of this undeserved suffering. But in the presence of her father, her protector and her champion, she was no longer alone. The Rock's eyes, burning with the promise of righteous vengeance, pierced Ms. Simmons' wavering facade of false bravery, tearing down her carefully constructed walls of self-assurance like a hurricane against a sandcastle. Ms. Simmons, realizing her mistake too late, grasped desperately at the last vestiges of authority, trying to shield herself from the cold truth with a false sense of arrogance. Her smirk, as fake as her teaching credentials, a brittle shield of self-assuredness, betrayed her as she folded her arms, a weak attempt to assert dominance over the towering presence of the Rock. "Well," she scoffed, her voice a shrill note of discordance in the silence, "I see you've come to complain about the punishment your daughter received." The Rock's stillness was an embodiment of his raw, focused strength. His voice, a seismic force unleashed, echoed through the classroom, reverberating against the walls like the threat of a gathering storm. "Punishment?" he uttered, the single word a blade of condemnation, cleaving through Ms. Simmons' pretense of innocence, exposing the truth of her malevolent intent for all to see. Ms. Simmons' thinly veiled defense unraveled like a cheap tapestry, her pretense of authority floundering under the rock's penetrating scrutiny. She gulped, her smirk now a pitiful remnant of the mask she had tried to wear, a mask that had begun to slip from her face. "Yes, as a teacher I have the right to enforce discipline. And your daughter," she stammered, her words now a mere attempt to defend the indefensible. The rock's fist, a weapon of devastating force, crashed into the nearest desk, splintering the wood as if it were nothing more than a child's toy. The students, already in a state of shock, jolted as if hit by a bolt of lightning, their bodies a chorus of fear, their screams a symphony of terror. Ms. Simmons, the full force of the rock's rage, suddenly turned upon her, staggered backward like a drunkard on a high wire, her face draining of color like a flower withering under a cruel sun. The rock, a predator advancing on his prey, took a single step forward, his movement heavy with intent, his eyes fixed on Ms. Simmons like a hawk zeroing in on a rabbit. "You humiliated my daughter," he growled, his voice a deafening roar in the confines of the classroom. Ms. Simmons, her hands raised in a feeble attempt to stay the onslaught, trembled as she uttered her desperate plea. Now wait just a second," Ms. Simmons stammered, her voice trembling, her words like feathers tossed against a hurricane. As the rock drew closer, each step an echo of impending doom, his voice, heavy with anger and righteousness, thundered through the room. "You violated her." The accusation, as damning as an axe blade, severed any hope of Ms. Simmons' denial. The other students, once her silent accomplices, stood by in stony silence, their eyes fixed on the drama unfolding before them, their expressions a silent jury, passing judgment on their teacher. The rock's voice, dropping like a hammer, filled the room with the dreadful promise of retribution. "And now you're going to learn what that feels like." As the words rang out like a death knell, Ms. Simmons, her terror overpowering her judgment, bolted for the door like a cornered rat, scrambling to escape the looming threat of her own undoing. Ms. Simmons' yelp of surprise, a primal sound of terror, filled the classroom as she was jerked back with a force that nearly dislocated her shoulder. Her back, her feeble escape attempt crushed like an insect against a boot, slammed against the chalkboard, the impact so violent that it sent a cloud of chalk dust erupting into the air, a mocking ode to her former position of authority. Ms. Simmons, her eyes wide with terror, stared up into the molten fury of the rock's gaze, knowing that she was about to face a reckoning of her own making. The rock, his form a towering inferno of wrath, loomed over Ms. Simmons, his shadow casting a pall over her quivering body. Stuttering like a broken record, Miss Simmons' excuses fell from her lips in a pathetic attempt to salvage her dignity. Look, she stammered, I was just... But the rock would not be pacified. His voice, icy and venomous, cut through her feeble excuses like a scalpel. Just what? The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch as the rock reached into his pocket, the slow, deliberate movement heightening the drama of the moment, and then, in a flash of gleaming metal, the razor appeared, a cold instrument of retribution in his massive hand. Miss Simmons, her breath ragged, her eyes bulging with fear, watched in horror as the rock turned the razor over in his fingers, the metal catching the light with a sinister gleam. Let's see how you like it. Ms. Simmons' scream was a banshee wail of desperation, her fear squeezing every ounce of resistance from her as the rock's hand snaked into her hair, his fingers tightening like a noose. No, please, not my hair, Ms. Simmons shrieked, her voice shrill and pitiful, the terror in her eyes mirroring the nightmare of her own device. And then, with a deafening roar that sent a chill down everyone's spine, the clippers ignited to life, their hungry teeth vibrating with the promise of destruction. Like a writhing beast caught in a hunter's trap, Ms. Simmons' struggles were futile against the rock's unyielding grip, her resistance crushed as he drew the razor across her scalp in a single, merciless stroke. Blonde strands falling in a bloody rain of retribution littered the classroom floor as students watched in a mix of horror and awe, their gasps rising like smoke from a funeral pyre. Ms. Simmons' wailing, a lamentation of her own making, echoed through the classroom like a twisted requiem, the hollow resonance of her cries a fitting tribute to the cruelty she had inflicted upon Lena. The students, transfixed by the gruesome spectacle, bore witness to Ms. Simmons' downfall, their eyes, once filled with fear, now shining with an intoxicated fascination. Finally, when the rock's razor fell silent and his fingers released their grip, Ms. Simmons was left stripped of her prized locks, her bald scalp a bare canvas of naked chignon. Ms. Simmons' body, trembling with shock and humiliation, sank to the floor as she sobbed uncontrollably, her hands clinging to the remains of her hair as if the strands could somehow protect her from the venomous reality of her own cruelty. But the rock, his towering presence looming over her like the wrath of a vengeful god, reached down with the pitiless strength of justice and grabbed her chin, forcing her gaze upward. His voice, low and ominous, whispered into her ear, his words a promise of poetic justice. This, the rock whispered into Ms. Simmons' ear, his breath a cold chill against her skin. This is what you did to my daughter. His grip tightened, the power in his fingers sending a bolt of fear through her trembling body. And this? His voice dipped lower, each syllable a razor edge of condemnation. This is your karma, now you know what it feels like, and believe me, this is just the beginning. Like a champion returning from a victorious battle, the rock stood, his eyes seeking out Lena, his face a portrait of paternal pride. With the gentleness of a protector and the strength of a warrior, he extended his massive hand to Lena, offering her the embrace of his reassurance. Lena, her eyes finally finding solace in her father's unwavering presence, rose from her seat and took his hand. With the grace of a conqueror, the rock turned, his footsteps resounding against the classroom floor, leading his daughter toward the door and away from the humiliation of Ms. Simmons' cruelty. As he stepped over the threshold, the echoes of Ms. Simmons' sobbing were drowned out by his final words, his voice resonating with a dangerous promise. If you ever touch my daughter again, I won't stop at your hair. And with that, he vanished into the corridor, leaving a wake of silence and awe in his path. The rock and his daughter Lena, their steps an unwavering march of dignity, disappeared from the classroom, leaving behind a scene of utter devastation in their wake. Ms. Simmons lay on the floor, a crumpled heap of shattered pride and crushed cruelty, her bald head bowing under the weight of the justice she had reaped from her own hateful harvest. And the rock, in his righteous fury, had delivered the most devastating blow of all, the blow of mercy. As the sun rose on the next day, the dawn of justice shone across the campus, illuminating Ms. Simmons' final defeat. News of the incident had spread like wildfire across social media, the viral video exposing Ms. Simmons' bigotry and cruelty to the world. Parents, outraged and vengeful, descended upon the school like a storm, their demands for her removal swift and merciless. For Lena, the ordeal had been a test of her spirit, her sense of self shaken, but ultimately strengthened by the unwavering support of her father. She walked through the halls, her stride confident and resolute, for she knew that no matter what this world threw her way, her father's love would shield her, his presence a fortress against injustice. And it was this knowledge, forged in the crucible of adversity, that gifted her with true strength. The strength to stand tall, to be unashamed, and to never bow to hatred or cruelty again.